The Wheel and the Butterfly, written by Justice3442 and read
by Gefurgic
and Fudgedig. Chapter 38, Dan and Pinky versus Wendigo. Wendigo? Pinky asked, staring out at the towering creature as it feasted on what was once Colby. That's not a Wendigo, she insisted.
It's a giant emaciated-looking creature that possesses and eats people,
Dan said, motioning out to the emaciated-looking creature which had possessed someone and was now eating someone else.
What else could it be?
But Pinky stared at the sit for a second and looked back at Dan. Wendigos are like snowy ghost horses that cover everything in ice.
What?
Dan replied with a confused look.
That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard,
Dan stated.
I thought Wendigos were like vengeful spirits that were mad at global warming,
Elise Sr. stated.
Okay, now that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard,
Dan said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he turned to point at Elise Sr. Wait, Chris began. If it's a Wendigo, do you think it's mad because Dawn purchased this cabin when it was originally the inheritance to a daughter, but her brother really wanted it, but the daughter sold it to Dawn instead? Chris asked.
Did you three all plan to out more on each other?
Dan asked, throwing his hands into the air in an exasperated manner. No, Pinky insisted. Wendigos are these bunch of ghosty horses that show up when people can't get along and they make it snowy and slowly freeze everyone to death, she explained. Dan sighed.
Okay, Pinky, you win. Your idea is by far the worst. Congratulations!
Yay! Pinky said enthusiastically, clapping her hands together. What do I win? She asked with a big grin.
You win, shut up!
Dan answered. Pinky's smile was quickly replaced by a pout.
Guys, that's totally a Wendigo,
Elise insisted.
I've read about them.
She continued to sip her tea and stare at the grisly display of a giant monster ripping Colby's lifeless body limb from limb and stripping the flesh from his bones.
Thank goodness its pants stayed on,
Elise added. Dan turned to her.
I know, right? We could have beholden something truly terrifying.
Yeah, no kidding,
Elise said, sipping her tea as blood sprayed onto the cabin porch. It's eating Colby, Don stated angrily as he motioned out to the beast. What could be more terrifying than that?
It could be naked,
Dan responded, holding up an index finger. One of Chris's eyes twitched. Ew. Pinky wrapped her arms around herself and shuddered. Yeah, that would be way too much beholdening for me, she insisted. Look, do any of you care that a brave man was just killed? Dawn demanded.
K-air?
Dan said, trying to process the foreign-sounding word. That thing you feel about Pinky and Mr. Mumbles, and occasionally me, Chris said.
Oh, well...
Dan thought about this for a moment.
Colby was dreamy, but somehow dumber than all three of you, so no.
Also, he wasn't so much brave as incredibly stupid, Pinky said.
Don't forget sexist,
Elise added. Pinky nodded. That too, but we were all gonna run out there at one point. Colby was told he shouldn't and did it anyway.
Junior, Elise
Sr. began.
You must have felt something for the man.
Elise raised an eyebrow.
You mean besides absolute contempt that he was an accessory to attempted murder of my husband?
Elise Sr. threw up her hands and turned palms up and eyes towards the ceiling.
Oh sure, you bring that up. Mom, Colby was an egotistical jerk when I dated him, and an even worse egotistical jerk when he became accomplished. Why do you think I broke up with him?
Elise Sr. and Dawn looked at each other. We assumed you did it to irritate us, honestly, Dawn stated.
Seriously? Even my breaking up with someone has to be about you two?
Elise exclaimed in a shocked tone. Wow, you two have perfected being terrible, Pinky stated.
I think even I'm appalled,
Dan stated.
And I once set Pinky's photo album on fire in front of her just because she painted and bedazzled my car.
Ah, Pinky smiled and put a hand on Dan's shoulder. But you made up for it. You also almost killed me in Mortal Kombat, Chris reminded irritably.
What?
Dan protested.
I stopped!
Pinky put an index finger up to her chin, which technically places you above Elise's parents. Elise Sr. and Dawn looked at each other contemplatively and looked back at their daughter.
Elise
Sr. began.
Is it too late to say, we're sorry? For attempting to take control of my life to the point where you almost got my husband killed? I would say so.
Elise replied angrily. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to face Pinky. Elise, it's never too late. Pinky stated as she locked her sky blue eyes with Elise's violet ones. Elise sighed out a
Fine.
Dawn and Elise Sr. opened their arms toward their daughter. Elise sighed and walked into their warm embrace. Elise Sr. looked up to Chris.
You too, son.
Chris narrowed his eyes. Why is it when I don't want to hug either of you two, you finally open up to me? Chris felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to face Pinky. Chris, please? Pinky asked, a slight tone of pleading in her voice. Oh, all right, Chris said as he hesitantly walked over to Elise and her parents and joined in on the group hug. Pinky turned to Dan. Isn't that sweet? You almost forget they're horrible, horrible people, Pinky said enthusiastically, motioning to Dawn and Elise Sr.
Blech, this mushy stuff just churns my stomach,
Dan stated. With a feral roar from outside, a loose collection of a human skeletal system was thrown into the cabin through the broken window and landed on the hardwood floor, scattering bones everywhere.
Oh yeah.
Dan mused, looking at the bones.
There's a flesh-hungry monster outside still.
Ooh, free Nightmare Night decorations, Pinky stated.
Pinky, stop being an idiot.
Dan commanded.
It's called Halloween here.
Oh, right, silly me, Pinky said with a smile, rubbing the back of her head. The four in the group hug broke their embrace to examine Colby's scattered skeletal remains. Chris looked up towards Pinky. Pinky, people usually bury remains and have funerals. Dan clapped his hands and rubbed his palms together.
Corpse party, all right,
he said with a smile. He can't spell funeral without fun, Pinky pointed out enthusiastically. Dawn turned to Chris and Elise. How do you figure out if they're joking or not? He asked. Elise looked back to her dad.
Chris and I gave up on that quite some time ago,
she admitted. You ready to celebrate your untimely demise, Colby? Pinky said. The four turned to see that Pinky had fetched Colby's skull and was holding it up in one of her hands. Pinky worked Colby's jaw up and down, talking through the skull as if it were a puppet. Sure, Pinky, no dancing though. I have nobody to dance with. Dan chuckled.
Isn't she precious?
He asked, patting Pinky on her head as she smiled back at him.
This is all very funny and incredibly disturbing,
Elise Sr. stated.
But shouldn't we do something about the giant monster outside?
Chris began laughing.
Chris?
Elise asked. No body, Chris uttered. Pinky grinned. Maybe we can play some music. I bet Colby's really good at the trombone. Chris broke into a fit of laughter. Stop, you're killing me.
At least she can't kill Colby.
Dan pointed out.
He's already dead,
he said with a smile. Chris closed his eyes. Chris's laughter increased as tears started to stream down his face. Dawn glared at Pinky and Dan. I bet you two think that's cool, he muttered in a fraternal, disappointed tone. Elise chuckled.
I thought it was funny. Hey everyone! Giant monster! Outside! Wants to eat us!
Elise Sr. stated, waving her hands back and forth in front of her to get everyone's attention. Oh, right, Pinky said, setting Colby's skull on the couch. She turned to Dan. Shall we run through the list? Elise raised an eyebrow as Chris attempted to get a lid on his laughter.
List?
She asked. Dan smiled.
Pinky and I have a list of options we go through when faced with a situation, like a giant radioactive monster attack or a long line at the supermarket,
he explained, motioning out with an upturned hand. Chris stopped laughing. Why do you have the same list for both of those things? He asked in a pensive tone. Dan turned to Pinky.
A.
Colby tried that. He got eaten, she pointed out. Dan pulled his lips to the side of his face.
B.
He continued. We didn't bring the suits or a hive. Dan quickly glanced at the ceiling.
C.
Mr. Mumbles trotted out of Dan and Pinky's bedroom and began hissing. Pinky raised an eyebrow. Do you really want to throw Mr. Mumbles out there?
Good point,
Dan replied.
D.
Did you bring any dogs? Pinky asked, raising her eyebrows. Dan frowned.
No.
His frown quickly changed to a smile.
E.
Pinky smiled nervously. Oh, I used the last of the dynamite on the snow fortress. Dan sighed and rolled his eyes.
F.
He said irritably. Yay! Pinky said as she smiled and clapped her hands together. F! I choose F! Dan brought a palm up to his face with an audible slap. What's F? Chris asked. Dan mumbled something inaudible. What? Chris said, moving closer to Dan.
F is for friendship, okay?
Dan replied irritably.
I'm surprised it's not fire,
Elise commented. Dan sighed.
Pinky won the coin toss.
Wait, Dawn began. Are you suggesting we try to make friends with that thing? Dawn exclaimed in a shocked tone. No, Pinky said, waving a hand back and forth in front of her. We need to make friends with each other, Pinky responded cheerfully. Dawn paused. I think I'd rather make friends with the monster. Pinky smiled and shrugged. Works for me. Hey, Dawn replied angrily. It was your idea, Pinky pointed out. Yeah, but Dawn began.
Dad, stop being a jerk to her. She's trying to help.
Elise pointed out. But she's just so weird, Dawn pointed out. Dawn felt a hand on his shoulder and turned to face his wife.
Dawn, she convinced Elise to forgive. Not throw you both in prison.
Elise corrected, raising an eyebrow.
Provided you behave,
she added. Elise Sr. sighed.
She convinced Elise to not turn us in for attempted murder. You can at least apologize to the girl.
But, Dawn began to protest.
Dawn!
Elise Sr. responded in a warning tone. Dawn sighed. Oh, all right. He turned to Pinky. I'm sorry I've been giving you such a hard time this trip, he said, avoiding Pinky's gaze. Pinky smiled. Forgiven. She replied, closing her eyes. She opened her eyes and turned to Elise Sr. Elise Sr. looked surprised and pointed to herself.
Me?
She exclaimed.
Mom, you could have been nicer to Pinky as well,
Elise replied. Elise Sr. looked at her daughter and scrunched her lips to the side of her mouth, considering this.
You're right, June. Elise, I could have been nicer.
She turned to Pinky.
Pinky, dear, I'm sorry.
Aw, that's okay, Pinky replied. She looked over the group. Okay, now that we're all friends... Chris held up an index finger. Abstaining from murdering each other on the spot, he corrected. I'll take it, Pinky replied, excitedly pointing at Chris. She revised her earlier statement. Now that we all tolerate each other enough not to kill each other, let's show the monster we're getting along and it will leave us in peace. Dan raised an eyebrow.
What kind of idiotic logic is that?
Well, where I'm from it could work, Pinky insisted.
You may have noticed the thing out there is not a...
Dan air-quoted.
Snowy horsey, and is in fact a 15-foot-tall monster with a great deal of the real estate in its head devoted to eating.
Come on, Dan, Pinky said optimistically. What's the worst that could happen? Dan motioned to the scattered bones on the floor. Pinky pursed her lips. It's okay, she insisted. We can show it from up here. Dan frowned.
I guess that's okay.
Great, Pinky exclaimed, setting her tea on the windowsill. Everyone join hands. Dan, Chris, and Elise also set their teas down. We're all going to die, Dawn mumbled in a soft, sing-song tone. Hush you, you'll scare the friendship vibes away, Pinky insisted. Dan grabbed Pinky's right hand, Chris her left. Elise grabbed Chris's other hand and then her mother's. Elise Sr. grabbed her husband's hand.
Now what?
Dan asked. Pinky beamed. Now we sing the friendship song. Dan began. Pinky immediately broke into the verse. Ooh, making friends is the goal. Friends will never leave you in a hole. So if you'd like to leave this place, and you don't want to vanish without a trace, you'll listen up and take my advice. We'll all get along and start playing nice. This is stupid, Dawn muttered.
Shush.
Elise Sr. shushed her husband.
Something about this song speaks to me. Be
nice to people you meet in cafeterias. Don't send your daughter's husband out to Siberia. Come on, everyone. You know the words.
Something, friends.
Dan sang. Friends will help you if you have the bands, Chris added.
And they'd let you enroll and dance,
Elise sang, shooting a look at her parents.
They wouldn't call the police on you even if they had the chance,
Elise Sr. sang, looking back at her daughter. Come on, Dawn, Pinky said with a big smile, swinging Dan and Chris's arms in the air. I'm not doing this, Dawn declared. Ooh, Dawn wants to be eaten by a Wendigo, Pinky sang. Dawn glared at her. When this doesn't work, I'll enjoy watching you eat crow, Dawn said. Pinky smiled and nodded. Good. Wait, what? Dawn said. Dan looked across the group to Dawn.
You rhymed, sorta.
Yeah, even if it wasn't a very good rhyme, Chris said. I didn't mean to, Dawn insisted. Looky, Pinky said, pointing out at the Wendigo. The group looked out towards the Wendigo. Blood was caked around its mouth, its beard, its slender dagger-like hands, and even its tight chest fur and skin that hugged its visible rib cage. Yet it had stopped growling or doing much of anything. Instead, it simply sat and stared into the broken window. I think it worked, Pinky said excitedly.
I think it thinks we're a bunch of morons because that's also what I think.
Dan replied. Come on, Dan, let's just go out there and show it what great acquaintances we all are, she insisted. Dan sighed and walked to the door as Pinky and everyone else followed, holding hands. He opened the door and walked out to the edge of the porch as everyone trailed behind him. The Wendigo stared at them and made a confused growling sound. See? Pinky stated. We just needed to get along, Pinky said triumphantly. Why is it still here then? Chris asked. Oh, I don't know, Pinky stated. She smiled. Maybe it needs a friend too.
Pinky, that sounds like a horrifically bad idea,
Dan said. Yeah, I agree with Dan on this, Chris stated. Oh, come on, Pinky said, letting go of Chris's hand and motioning to herself. I'm a great judge of character, she insisted.
Yeah, you live with Dan,
Elise Sr. said in a sarcastic tone. Don chuckled.
Hey!
Dan protested. He let go of Pinky's hand and pointed to himself.
I'm awesome,
he declared. Elise's eyes went wide.
Dan?
What?
Dan exclaimed. Elise pointed out towards the Wendigo. Dan turned.
Pinky, what the heck are you doing?
He called in alarm. Pinky had walked off to the porch and was now standing next to the Wendigo, which was staring down at her with a blank expression. What do you say, Mr. Cannibalistic Beastie? Do you need a friend? Pinky asked as she cocked her head. She smiled and reached out for one of the Wendigo's large, slender fingers. Swat. The Wendigo quickly shifted its hand in back of it and slammed into Pinky. Her body flew through the air and into the cabin through the broken window. Crash! Thump! The loud sound of Pinky impacting with the cabin wall was heard, followed by her hitting the floor.
Pinky!
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 Dan, Elise, and Chris called out, all running back inside. I'm okay, Pinky replied. Dan, could you be a deer and pop my shoulder back into place? And also pull the deer antler out of my thigh? Dan ran up to his injured roommate. A bump protruded from her left shoulder, and one of the large elk trophies sat on the floor, a couple inches of one of its points buried into Pinky's right thigh. Blood poured out of her nose, and the skin around one of her eyes was turning black.
Pinky?
Dan said softly. Yes, Dans, Pinky replied, her head lolling around and her eyes unfocused.
Out of the stupid things you've done, that was by far the stupidest.
Pinky sighed. I know, Dans. Elise ran up with some medical supplies and a wet rag.
Here, Pinky, clean your face with this,
Elise said, handing the rag back to Pinky. Thanks, Elise, you're ah! Pinky shrieked.
Sorry, Pinky, I needed to get that antler out of you and get that puncture wound treated,
Elise explained. Pinky took a few shallow breaths. That's okay, I just wish you ah!
Oh, pipe down,
Dan ordered.
The quicker your shoulders popped back into place, the better.
Pinky whimpered. You two are great friends, she said through gritted teeth. Great, painful friends. Here, Chris handed an ice pack to Pinky. Put this on your eye. Pinky winced. No pulling anything out of me or popping anything back into place, please. Chris smiled. I'll try to control myself. Pinky tentatively grabbed the ice pack and placed it over her black eye. Thanks, Chris, that was very...
Sorry, Pinky, but that wound needed to be disinfected,
Elise stated as she capped a bottle of rubbing alcohol. Stop being painful best friends, Pinky pleaded of Elise and Dan. Well, that was a complete waste of time, Dawn commented. Pinky frowned. Dan leveled an angry glare at Dawn and opened his mouth, but Chris was on his feet and approaching Dawn before he could say anything. Hey, leave her alone. At least she tried something, Chris insisted. So, Colby tried something and none of you showed him any concern, Dawn countered. He helped try to kill me, Chris reminded. He leveled an angry index finger at Dawn. You tried to kill me. Yeah, well, now Colby's dead, but at least he died like a man, Dawn exclaimed. Dan raised an eyebrow.
By having his throat ripped out?
No, Dawn shouted. He died trying to protect his family. He turned back to Chris. All you've done is sit here and look stupid. Pinky looked at Elise. Did your dad already forget Chris was going to run out to save you? Elise sighed.
Seems that way.
Chris's eyes narrowed. It's not like you've done anything except to get saved, beaten up by your daughter, and complain about everything.
Both of you stop!
Elise Sr. ordered.
This isn't getting us anywhere!
Maybe we should try the friendship song again, Pinky suggested joyfully.
Shut up!
Everyone else commanded. Or quiet. Quiet's good, Pinky offered meekly.
Look,
Dan said sternly.
there's only 2 ways to get rid of a Wendigo spirit.
Pinky smiled.
And no, friendship is not one of them.
Pinky whimpered softly and pouted as Elise wrapped Pinky's leg in gauze. All right, Dan, what do we do? Chris asked.
First, we exorcise it.
Dan stated. Elise knitted her brow.
How do we do that? First, we hold the afflicted down.
Dan began. The group looked out at the 15-foot-tall grotesque beast that stared back at them with glowing, hungry eyes. A steady stream of drool dripped out of the side of its mouth as its large tongue dangled out from the collection of razor-sharp teeth.
Yeah, that's not happening.
Elise replied.
Okay, well, we can also pour boiling fat down the afflicted's throat to thaw the Wendigo's icy heart.
Dan said.
Great idea!
Elise Sr. said, rolling her eyes.
We'll just hand it a big pot of boiling fat and ask it to drink up.
Dan tapped his chin with an index finger and looked towards the ceiling.
Yeah, admittedly, this would be easier if Colby didn't feed himself to the thing.
Elise sighed.
I guess it's better than sitting here and waiting to freeze to death when we run out of firewood.
Dan looked at Chris.
Chris, we'll need to cook all the bacon you have.
But I need that bacon for eating, Chris protested.
Look, unless you have several gallons of lard just laying...
Chris walked over to the kitchen and opened one of the cupboards, revealing a large tub of lard. Everyone paused and looked at Chris. What? Chris asked. What else am I supposed to fry the bacon in? Dan smiled.
Chris, for once, your disgusting habits might just save us all.
4 pounds of cold lard turned boiled later. Elise dipped a ladle into the boiling white liquid. She took it out and carefully poured the contents into a stainless steel canteen with a green cloth buttoned up around it. She quickly screwed the lid of the canteen close.
I'm not sure how long this will stay hot,
she commented. She turned to the occupants of the cabin.
Everyone ready?
Ready!
Ready!
Pinky and Dan replied. Pinky held up her chainsaw. Dan held up a machete. Dawn turned to Dan and Pinky. I can't believe you two actually had a badminton racket and birdie, he said, holding those things he just mentioned in that sentence you just read.
Yeah,
Dan replied.
Terror at Badminton Sorority Camp is a pretty strange movie.
Elise,
Sr. began.
You wouldn't happen to have another gun on you, would you?
Elise bent down and reached around her ankle, producing a small boxy pistol and handing it to her mother. Elise Sr. gripped the weapon and examined it, turning off the safety as she kept her hand off the trigger.
This will do.
Hey, Pinky,
Dan said in a serious tone. Pinky looked towards her roommate. Yes, Dan?
in case we don't make it, there's something I need to tell you.
Dan said, trailing off. Everyone else paused and looked at the short man in a black jerk shirt and the taller woman in the pink parka. There's something I need to tell you, too, Pinky said softly. Dan held his machete at his side and walked closer to Pinky. Pinky held her chainsaw at her side and closed the distance further. The two looked deeply into each other's eyes, sky blue eyes meeting green eyes in the soft light of the cabin.
Pinky,
Dan swallowed.
I threw the last cupcake at a moose because it looked at me stupid.
Pinky smiled. That's okay. I ate the last lactose-free brownie, she admitted. Dan smiled and held his arms out.
Bestest buddies forever?
He asked. Pinky's smile widened as she held her arms open and gave her roommate a big, snuggly hug. Best buddies forever, she answered.
Oh, come on!
Elise shouted. Dan and Pinky turned to her. What? Pinky asked. Elise sighed.
Nothing,
she muttered.
All right.
Dan said resolutely as he let go of Pinky.
Now that the mushy stuff is over, all we need is someone stupid enough to serve as a distraction as we attack that thing and force it to drink boiling fat.
Dan stated, looking from side to side. Dan frowned. Elise began to look around frantically.
Where's Chris?
Suddenly, the blue sedan roared to life, and its headlight shot into the darkness like a large slumbering creature that had just awoken.
Oh no,
Elise murmured. The Wendigo howled as a blue sedan turned onto the road and sped down the icy path. The shambling beast gave chase.
We have to help him!
Elise shouted. Pinky rolled her eyes. Well, duh, she answered. Or, Dawn interjected, we can get in the RV and use Chris's sacrifice to get away. Ooh, or I could chop off Don's legs with his chainsaw and we can let the monster eat him while we get away. Pinky replied. Dawn trailed off and looked at the smiling girl with the long pink curls and large red chainsaw.
She'd do it, too,
Dan assured. On second thought, let's go save my son-in-law, Dawn said, attempting to sound heroic. Yay! Pinky replied. Headlights pierced the night, revealing a white pathway with large evergreen trees on either side that jutted into the sky like long, jagged spears. Chris drove the car over the icy road, the wheels constantly losing traction on the surface as he picked up speed. He glanced into the rearview mirror and smiled as he saw the thin, giant beast close on his tail. His smile changed to panic as the car hit a large patch of ice and began fishtailing. Chris attempted to regain control of the vehicle, but the road curved and the car came to a rather sudden stop as the passenger side had a rendezvous with a large tree trunk. Chris felt himself jerk forward suddenly, then was pulled back into his seat by his seatbelt. Metal screamed as it bent under pressure. The windshield cracked. The passenger window shattered and showered Chris in tiny jewels of glass that cut at his skin. Chris looked up into the rearview mirror as he heard a deep, blood-curdling roar. The beast was almost to the car. I guess this is as far as I go. The beast reached over and grabbed the driver's side door, scythe-like fingers digging into it and into the thin metal and crushing it like a soda can. Chris grinned to himself as he felt the hair on his skin change to fur and the muscles in his body expand. All right, monster, you want to fight? Let's get feral.
Author's note. What's it?
Dear Larry Fessenden, please stop putting Wendigos in your movie when it makes no sense to do so. Thanks.
You know what, I think we should read some comments. Let's see. Mithril Moth. Oh, that reminds me, Mithril Moth, you've been missing some typos lately.
Thanks for listening, listeners, and I'll see you tonight.